What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Triple Play Fantasy YouTube channel. Glad you could join us for another video, and we got a great topic to talk about today. Today, we are talking about fantasy playoff superstars. Say it with me again. Superstars. That's right. We're looking for guys that we can buy low coming off of subpar outings recently. We can buy these guys right now from our league mates and they can ride us to a fantasy championship, right? So, right now, with the playoffs in most leagues being weeks 15, 16, and 17, we can kind of look ahead, look at some matchups down the stretch, and look at, hey, can these guys help me out when I'm in the fantasy playoffs? You can kind of identify, are you a contender or are you rebuilding for next year, right? Or if you're in a redraft league, are you basically hoping you're not getting last place, right? So let's start with the first guy on this list because we got 6 of them. And that's going to be the cover boy, Russell Wilson, quarterback for the Seattle Seahawks. And what we're doing is we're looking ahead for the rest of the season at their strength of schedule and their fantasy playoff strength of schedule. So we start out right now. The Seattle Seahawks actually have the 4th best remaining strength of schedule as far as 30, 40, and 1 for the rest of their scheduled opponents. So again, 4th best as far as the easiest remaining. And Wilson himself has the 8th best remaining strength of schedule for quarterbacks. Opponents are allowing 16.94 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks for the remaining schedule that they have. Now let's look a little bit deeper. This is the fantasy playoffs weeks 15 through 17. Russell Wilson does have the 16th best playoff schedule for quarterbacks, so he is a little bit below average as far as the fantasy playoff schedule, and that's a total of 55.6 cumulative fantasy points per game allowed of each team's 2021 opponents during that time. Now, obviously, again, the playoff schedule for him isn't necessarily the greatest one, but Russell Wilson, obviously, after his last 2 games, he hasn't had any touchdowns in his last 2 games, has a barely over 50% completion percentage, but going into Monday night against Washington, which allows the most fantasy points to quarterbacks by a decent margin. And you just saw Cam Newton last Sunday score 30 fantasy points on them. I think this is where Russell Wilson gets right. He gets his confidence back, and the opponents he's going to play isn't even going to have a factor. And I think Russell Wilson will get back on track this week. He's actually my QB1 on the week, and he will carry that momentum down the stretch for you in the fantasy playoffs. Let's talk about another guy here. Let's go to David Montgomery. You guys remember last year the stretch he went on to end up finishing in the top tier of running backs and basically elevate himself into a top 3 or 4 round pick in drafts this year. Well, David Montgomery, the Bears themselves have the 11th best remaining strength of schedule down the stretch here, 33, 38, and 1. And then Montgomery himself has the fifth best remaining strength of schedule for running backs, 22.17 fantasy points per game with the strength of schedule for opponents for running backs there. But let's look at his fantasy playoff schedule, weeks 15 through 17. Montgomery has the best playoff schedule for running backs right now. 88.2 cumulative fantasy points per game allowed of each team's 2021 opponents from that time. Guys, that is absolutely fantastic. During weeks 15 through 17, he's projected to face the Vikings, the Seahawks, and the Giants, okay? And that's pretty nice and juicy. He does play the Vikings twice, but the Vikings are in week 18. The Vikings right now are allowing a league high as far as yards per carry, and they've given up 4 touchdowns to running backs over the last 3 weeks, okay? They are right now, obviously, a very vulnerable defense. The Seahawks rank 2nd worst as far as points allowed to running backs at 30.4 fantasy points per game. So he has that. Minnesota ranks 11th, but like I said, again, they are right now extremely struggling stopping the run. And then the Bears in week 17 play the Giants, who themselves are not any necessarily word beaters. They are 5th worst as far as giving up 27.1 fantasy points per game to running backs. Again, David Montgomery is set to smash at the fantasy post. If you can get him for a cheap price now, that's definitely where you want to go. Javonte Williams is my next guy on here, and you could call the Javonte Williams and Melvin Gordon, but the Broncos coming off a bye, I do believe Javonte Williams is going to start getting more work, and he's going to be more involved in this offense. He's going to have closer to 20 touches a game, and if he's the lead guy in Denver, this looks really great down the stretch for him because the Broncos have the 9th best remaining strength of schedule, 37, 34, and 1, Williams, the second best remaining strength of schedule for running backs, 22.59 fantasy points per game, the opponents. And then the fantasy playoffs, 15 through 17. Williams, the fourth best playoff schedule for running backs, which is just under 80 cumulative points. One of the things I am going to bring up about with Melvin Gordon is Melvin Gordon right now has incentives in his contract. And is it crazy to say that once Melvin Gordon does reach those incentives, that he basically wants to save his body? Right now, the Broncos are not contending for a Super Bowl, and he wants to extend his career and get another contract because he's in the last year of his deal. Why would he go out there and risk unnecessary hits for there's no more guaranteed money in his deal and there's no Super Bowl aspirations? So I would not be shocked if there was some type of made up injury or something that he does as a business decision once he does reach those incentives to where he's not on the field quite as much. And Javonte Williams, for that reason, takes a lead role. But I do think Javonte Williams, this will be his job sooner rather than later this season. This may be the last week you can get him for as cheap as he is, especially with that playoff schedule down the stretch. That is ridiculous. All right. Next guy we're going to talk about is Chase Claypool, wide receiver for the Pittsburgh Steelers. And the Steelers have the second hardest remaining strength of schedule. So the opponents they're playing are pretty tough, 46 and 27 overall. But the Steelers wide receivers have the third best remaining strength of schedule for wide receivers, 31.51 points per game. The reason I have Chase Claypool on here is most people are not looking to trade Deontay Johnson. And if they are trading him, it's most likely going to cost you a lot of money. Right now, Chase Claypool, I said money. It's going to cost you probably an expensive player. Chase Claypool is somebody you might be able to get right now. He just came off one of his better games this season. And right now, you may be able to buy in on the dip. Obviously, you have no juju there. Pat Freiermuth has had a lot of touchdowns, but not necessarily a ton of catches. Chase Claypool should be more involved into this offense. He's the deep threat, and you can get him a little, again, cheaper than Deontay Johnson. Claypool has the ninth best playoff schedule for wide receivers and that 110.36 cumulative points through the fantasy playoffs. He is a good get right now if you can get him. But on the other end of the spectrum, we have a guy that's coming off his best game of the year. That's Elijah Moore of the New York Jets. And the Jets surprisingly have the fifth best remaining strength of schedule, a 31 and 41 record of their opponents. And Moore has the seventh best remaining strength of schedule for wide receivers during that time, over 31 points per game. You look down to the fantasy playoffs, Moore, the third best playoff schedule for wide receivers, just under 115 total cumulative points. He's really been coming on recently. His target share has gone up. The average depth of target has gone up each of the last few weeks. He's becoming a focal point in this offense, no matter who the quarterback is. The Jets should have a lot of negative game scripts, which should be plenty for Moore, who's going to be playing a lot in the slot, and he'll get weaker corners week to week. Last guy we're going to talk about is our first tight end. That's Logan Thomas, tight end for the Washington football team. Oh, guys, let me tell you, the reason Logan Thomas is on here is I expect him to be healthy sooner rather than later. And if he assumes this role in this offense over Ricky Seals-Jones and over all the other backups in Washington, look how it's set up for right now. Washington does have the 16th hardest schedule remaining, so they're about in the middle of the pack at 35 and 37. But the best remaining strength of schedule for tight ends, over 14 points per game. And even better, once you get to the fantasy playoffs, the best playoff schedule for tight ends at just under 53 cumulative fantasy points for those 3 weeks. Guys, you can't, that lines up perfectly. And right now, no one is going to be trying to hold Logan Thomas, or maybe he's even been cut in your league. This is the perfect time to go get him, okay? When you see something like that line up for the fantasy playoffs and you're in contention, that could be the tight end that's a difference from giving you a bagel to giving you double digits, which could win you a fantasy matchup. Now, guys, very important that you look ahead. We are only 3 weeks away from the start of fantasy playoffs for most of you guys. So this is the type of thing you need to do. You need to look at players that you can buy low now, that you can buy the production you're expected to see down the road come the fantasy playoffs. You do this. This is what wins you league titles. This is what you get to. You can wear your belts. You can wear your whatever you have, your rings, whatever you do, you can celebrate with your league mates. I won. I put in the work. I did the type of thing where I'm looking ahead into these playoffs. These types of guys are going to jump out off the page, and you're going to have matchups that you're going to really like down the stretch. And you're going to be thankful that you picked up these guys or you traded for these guys while their values are not quite where they could be in a few weeks. Guys, thank you so much for checking out another video on the Triple Play YouTube channel. Make sure to subscribe and smash that like button if you enjoy the content here. And we love giving it to you guys. So anything you want to see, let us know in the comments below. And guys, until the next one, We'll see you then.